So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along. I know you are very, very busy in schools. However, I think this promises to be a great session again. No pressure, Fran. Apologies for that. For those who don't know me, my name is Kat Calvert. I am the Workstream Lead Officer for Wellbeing for Learning in the West Partnership. Prior to this, I was a head teacher in North Lanarkshire and remain a head teacher in North Lanarkshire as my substantive post. I was there for 7 years as a head teacher. So this is something that inclusion is very close to my heart and huge workload for us, huge area of work for all of us. So we're really lucky to have Fran Foreman, who's a Senior Education Officer and part of the inclusion team in Education Scotland, and I am going to hand over to Fran. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Kat, to say no pressure. Never thought of myself as a YouTuber. Hello, everybody. Really nice to have you all on the call today. This session is just an overview. It's a wee introduction to dyscalculia. There's going to be an opportunity for you to hear about some of the new work that's taking place nationally, and also an opportunity for you to, in your breakout rooms, to have a chat and a discussion about what it means to you, and maybe to have a think about areas where you think you would benefit from some support. There's a couple of questions in that, some reflective questions for you. Please, I don't know if you can see how many slides there are. Please don't be put off by them. I will, I can give these slides to Kat if she wants to share them out. That's not a problem. There are some links, some hyperlinks within it that you'll be able to access as well. And if you've got any queries, just don't hesitate to get back in touch. As Kat said, I work within Education Scotland. My national remit is inclusion and additional support needs. So, as I mentioned, the sort of the overview of dyscalculia is one of the main aims of this session. It genuinely isn't possible to go into great depth in just really like in an hour's session per se, but hopefully this will whet your appetite. It'll give you some links to have a look at and some things to consider. We're going to outline some of the characteristics of dyscalculia and their impact that has on learning, and just share that overview of some supports and resources and future resources that are coming down the line very soon for you that you'll be able to access, irrespective of where you're working. So those of you that have joined any of our sessions before, I've done, I think, some on dyslexia. I always do start off with that Scottish context because it is really important. I'm not going to read the slide verbatim, but it's just really to highlight that we have got, in terms of our framework within Scottish education, our legislative framework and our policy framework, that inclusion sits at the heart of that. We are, it has been reviewed internationally within Britain. We know that there is nothing fundamentally wrong with our policies and legislation. We can be very proud of the fact that we've got a really learner-centred system. We do know, though, that there are issues and have been issues in terms of implementation. So I can assure you, I'm not sitting here saying everything is absolutely perfect. You may be aware of the Additional Support for Learning Action Plan. That the second edition of that got published last November, so very much a work in progress. And this type of session, is really part of that, trying to help share information about additional support needs, specific areas of need, and in this case it's dyscalculia. What's really important, though, is that everybody understands that you do not need a formal label or a formal identification or diagnosis of need in order to get support in Scotland. That hasn't been the case since the implementation of the Act, the Additional Support for Learning Act. I still meet people that still do have that impression for lots of different reasons, that if a child hasn't been formally identified with dyscalculia, then we can't put the supports in place. Absolutely incorrect, not the case at all. That the label itself can bring something very valuable to that learner, to their family. So if we have the evidence, and I'll talk through a little bit about the sort of identification process, it's exactly the same as what we would be saying for dyslexia. We're looking at this very holistically. It's not determined in a sense by one particular one-off assessment at all. It's gathering all of that information about the learner, because at the end of the day we're needing to meet the learner's needs. But as I mentioned, not lose sight that for them that label or that term may be really, really important, but legally it doesn't stop us from supporting that young person or that child. I hope that makes sense. And I suppose take a moment to reflect. What does dyscalculia mean to you, as an individual? Feel free to put some things in the chat if you want, or just, have a think about that as we're going through, because I think we've all got either a preconception or a thought in our head about what does dyscalculia mean. We're not as far on in terms of research for dyscalculia compared to where we are for dyslexia. I've got some information coming up on the next slide for you. There is a lot of misunderstanding about dyscalculia because of that. So in Scotland, for example, since 2010, we've had a national pathway for dyslexia. We've got our, dyslexia toolkit, and very early on, when that resource was up and running, we were beginning to receive queries. What about dyscalculia? And because we didn't have, certain things in place in Scotland, the advice, and it's good advice, was to say, well, actually, just use the same process that you would be using for identifying dyslexia, but in terms of dyscalculia. So Mrs. Garvey's put in the chat, a learning need relating to numeracy instead of language. Yeah, absolutely. That is one way of looking at it, totally. I would say, dyslexia is more than language. And there are commonalities between dyslexia and dyscalculia. There's co-occurrence, as we would call it. We really, really avoid the term comorbidity because it doesn't sound very nice. So we like co-occurrence. So what do we know about dyscalculia? Okay, I mentioned that there has genuinely been less research into this area. That does not mean there hasn't been research, because there absolutely has, but there's less of it. We estimate around about 4 to 6% of the population have dyscalculia, where it's 4 to 10 of dyslexia. Getting those figures is not easy because of the research not being there in the same way. But we're not talking about a very tiny percentage of the population. Learners whose parents have dyscalculia are apparently 10 more times likely to be dyslexic. That's really, really interesting. 50% of learners with dyscalculia have siblings who are dyscalculic. Environmental factors can affect the difficulty in mathematics and dyscalculia. Well, that wouldn't be a surprise to you. It's a really important factor when we're looking at any area of need. What's the environment that the learner is in, but not that their learning environment at home, their learning environment in the community and at school has a really, really important part to play. And it can absolutely impact on everyday life. So, when you think about all of the different activities that we're involved with, particularly as we grow up and, become adults, that numeracy and mathematics can play and do play a very important part in that. And when you do experience a difficulty, barriers are then, you do experience a barrier. There's a barrier created. I don't know if you are aware, but last year in April 2022, we published a Scottish working definition of dyscalculia. And prior to that, that was one of the reasons, because we didn't have a definition, that was one of the reasons it was quite difficult to kind of create resources or create advice and guidance. Definitions don't stand up in a court of law. Just to be quite clear on that. But the fact we have a Scottish working definition is really, really positive. There will therefore be an expectation, if a local authority or an establishment isn't using any, they should at least be using the Scottish working definition, and that works exactly the same for dyslexia. And you can see, if you're aware of the dyslexia working definition, you'll see there's a similarity. We've used a really similar format in terms of this pictorial one, and I'll kind of talk around some of those as we go around. It's really, really important to bear in mind that at all stages, dyscalculia is on a continuum, and it can vary from mild to severe, with a range of strengths and difficulties which are affected by the nature of the activity that's undertaken, the learning environment that the young person is in, and any coping strategies and supports in place. So in an ideal world, the learning environment will be great for that person, that individual, whether it's an adult or whether it's a learner, a child, young person, and they can tap into good strategies. What we do know is exactly the same with dyslexia. If we don't have that early identification in place, if the young child and young person at an early age doesn't develop an understanding of their kind of learning needs and their strategies, they will not become as confident about how to overcome them as they get older. And indeed, they may really experience some resistance to the suggestion of certain strategies when they get older. If it just doesn't become part and parcel of their daily kind of life, really, their daily routines. So early intervention, helping them access a range of support strategies that meet their needs. It's not about thinking about the strategies that I would use, assuming that that's also going to meet, a child's needs as well, because they're going to be different. Every individual with dyscalculia will differ in how they're affected and in the level of severity experienced. However, there are a common set of indicators that can be observed, which are included within this working definition, that you can see as you work around the screen. I'm moving my cursor because you can't see that, sorry. So they're not in any particular order as you work around, clockwise. One area is not any higher priority than another. It's just the way that they're placed. And what I'll do is through the session, particularly when you're in your breakout rooms, I'll put some links into the chat because we have this information within our National Improvement Hub, and you'll be able to access that. So, as I mentioned, in August 2021, the Scottish Government put together a working party. Now, Education Scotland, I led on that. And we looked at a whole range of evidence and research that was around when we were kind of devising our definition, our working definition. And the main purpose of any working definition that we have is to provide education staff, irrespective of your role, partners, families, learners, with this nationally agreed definition, this nationally agreed descriptors of the range of indicators of associated, we refer to it as associated difficulties of dyscalculia. And we launched this in April 2022. So it's quite a short working group, actually, much shorter than it was when we did the dyslexia one. But you can see here that this text is taken from the definition. So it is a neurodevelopmental learning difference, which can co-occur with a range of other specific learning needs. Now, neurodevelopmental learning differences, that is an umbrella term for a range of areas of need, and dyscalculia is one of those. Predominantly, people really talk about autism when they're talking about that, but it actually does include dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia as well. Dyscalculia can be described as a specific difficulty, in understanding number and number processes. Oh, somebody can't see the slides and it's kicking you out. I've just seen that. Sometimes if you rejoin.
She's going to go and join from another device.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so understanding number and number processes which persists despite the provision of appropriate learning opportunities, that is really, really important. That the learner has had the opportunity to, as a practitioner, they've been provided with different strategies, different supports before we immediately jump to the conclusion that somebody, is, for example, in this case, dyscalculic. It's distinguishable from other challenges associated with numeracy and maths due to this persistent inability to understand and/or to retrieve numerical facts from memory, and the use of underdeveloped procedures and processes, and the severity of difficulties with number sense. So it is really specific. You may have heard, and I've heard on many occasions, people can say, well, I'm not very good at maths, so I must be dyscalculic, or I don't know my times tables very well, so I must be dyscalculic. That's a really broad statement. And when you look at this particular slide, we really are looking at these 3 bullet points and making sure that, you know, there has been that adequate support in place. The characteristics that you'll see from an individual may really vary, and indeed some may not know their times tables, but it doesn't mean that everybody in that case is dyscalculic. And I think as well, my mathematic colleagues, because, you know, this working group that developed this definition was a fantastic group of people to work with. There were teachers, we had mathematical specialists in it, we had education psychologists, you know, everybody worked really hard on it, and as I say, we managed to do this fairly quickly, coming up with this definition, but really clear that we want to move away from this, for some reason, acceptable myth that maths is a really difficult subject, and people can constantly get away with saying, I'm rubbish at maths, I'm poor at maths. You don't normally say that about other subject areas in, I don't know, such quantity. You don't hear it as much as that. So on behalf of my mathematical colleagues, I'm really getting that plea in. So I think the interesting thing for you, you know, if you didn't know this already, is to consider these associated difficulties which are on this slide. And again, when you look at the whole definition, what I've done here is I've broken it up into slides. So there can be difficulties with estimating numbers, time, space, subitizing. And by that we mean it's that immediate recognition of a quantity without counting. That's a really big clue. How numbers and amounts relate to each other in their representation, recognizing and understanding number symbols, learning and recalling basic maths facts and processes, ordering, sequencing and directionality, applying number skills to solve problems, everyday tasks involving number, for example, money and time, and short-term and working memory. Now, that's quite a long list, but it is actually, in one way, it's quite a specific list, but you'll see the co-occurrence with other areas of specific learning differences, particularly that short-term and working memory. You know, that some people often think, you know, but I'll not give it away, when you look at dyslexia, you know, that there is this co-occurrence, this kind of alignment, but they are different. They really are. And the other thing I would really like to stress, this is not, should never really be seen as an indication of somebody's cognitive ability. If you have short-term or working memory, that does not mean the child that you're working with, for example, you know, is not clever, cannot demonstrate their cognitive ability. It's the processing in your brain that the difficulties are in. The difficulties, as I've just mentioned before, they don't reflect an individual's cognitive ability. Can't stress that enough. It's really important when we're talking to families and to the young people and the children themselves to reassure them of that. They may not be typical of a performance in another area and cannot be attributed to other factors. For example, gaps in learning, a developmental issue, genetic, neurodevelopmental differences, which include autism, dyslexia, and attention difficulties. So when you're looking at dyscalculia, you've got to be really clear that it is dyscalculia. The impact of dyscalculia as a barrier to learning will absolutely vary in accordance to their learning and teaching environments, and that's obviously understandable. It does exist in all cultures, across all ranges of abilities and across all socio and economic backgrounds. If you're thinking about the impact of poverty Of course, poverty can make things exacerbate difficulties, make things worse, but poverty is not the causal factor of a neurodevelopmental difference. It will exacerbate it, but it's not the causal factor. Learners with dyscalculia can continue to make progress in mathematics, but they may do so at a different pace. And I think that's an element that people maybe don't assume will happen and can happen. Dyscalculia is likely to be genetic, lifelong, and as I've mentioned before, it's a neurodevelopmental difference. It doesn't mean in every single case there's a genetic link, but if a family, come to you and they say, we have a family member who does have an identification of dyscalculia, and I think my child has, we need to take cognizance of that, irrespective of what age they are. Unidentified, well, dyscalculia can result in mathematics anxiety, which is not the same as dyscalculia, but can have a really negative impact on an individual. Low self-esteem, high stress, atypical behavior, and low achievement. And this can have associated impacts on opportunities in adult life. And when you're looking at it in that bigger picture, in terms of, if you take that personal aspect out of it, in that economic wider picture for Scotland, it can have an impact. So it's a specific learning difference that needs to be taken seriously. And we, as mentioned in the definition, we can kind of split it into these two areas, the number sense and the subitizing. Remember that subitizing, I'm going to give you some graphic examples of that. So dyscalculic learners, they absolutely encounter difficulties in developing number sense. The research has shown that dyscalculic learners got particular difficulties with subitizing. It's not that they cannot develop a number sense, it's just that they need more time. And so as a teacher or an educator who's supporting them, that needs to be factored in. And that needs to be explained to the learner and to the family, perhaps why they're having to have more time to decide to do this. They need to have this time so they can develop the concepts, these mathematical concepts that you're trying to share. So we look at number sense, and what do we mean by number sense? I'm sure you already know what do we mean by number sense, but in terms of dyscalculia, it's really, really important. It's an important concept and it begins to develop in early mathematics. So therefore, really important that all mathematical skills build upon this. And as a teacher, as we're working with children as they progress through the system, it's really important to know that they have those foundations in place. It can so easily be missed. You'll be fully aware that children and people can be really very good at masking and hiding things. And for a range of different reasons, they may miss out on a particular piece of learning that could have been really critical for them getting that number sense. And I have seen in a secondary, I am a secondary teacher, that actually when you're working with a secondary pupil and you realise that they don't have these foundation skills, they've just managed somehow to get through the system, and it isn't uncommon. It's really important that, as I mentioned, that all these mathematical skills are built upon this concept, and that learners, number sense is as basic to mathematics as phonemic awareness is basic to language in learning to read. So number sense is the ability to develop that relationship with numbers, between numbers, to develop a sense of quantity, the size of the value, the number in relation to another, and how they can use this to make valid comparisons. It's also the ability to understand and use mathematical language and symbols to explain these comparisons and to use the sense to carry out calculations. That can be really difficult if you are supporting a learner who's also dyslexic and maybe mixing up the language and may not actually be able to read the language as well. So that's where the different range of strategies must come in to help them, auditory hear them as well as visually seeing them. So developing this number sense, it does help lead to that fluency and accuracy when using numbers. Learners who have number sense, we know that they understand what the numbers represent, what they can be used for, and they use them flexibly as they then grow and move through life. Learners who develop this number sense effectively, they then can tap into this range of mathematical strategies at their disposal. And if you're dyscalculic, that is definitely a barrier, because you have to think a bit harder about what strategy you're going to use, and your range of strategies will probably be quite reduced. And so normally sorry, not normally, hate that word normally. What would normally happen though, in terms of, learners who do have this fluency, is they'll know how to adapt their strategies. Learners with poor number sense, they may really, really struggle, and they'll be unable to subitize even with small numbers. They will struggle with estimating if the numerical answer is reasonable or if it's correct. There'll be a lot of guesswork involved. They may find it difficult or sometimes even impossible, for example, to count backwards. They could well have trouble sequencing, particularly, remembering numbers as well. Really, really difficult. And as I said, don't be surprised if they can also become very adept at trying to hide this and look as if they do know what they're doing. So mentioned here, you can see it on these slides. In a nutshell, this is really what we're talking about with number sense. Let's leave that for a second for you to see. And, when you're looking at this calculation of 21 minus 6, if you've got good number sense, depending on your age and stage, you could work that out quite automatically. And there are different ways in which to do it. And there has been research on, exploring how do you come up with these calculations. Are you working backwards to find it? Are you, thinking about, blocking up the numbers? Say we're just giving a wee overview today, but these are just different ways in which you will have seen your learners come to an answer to get that sum. If you're dyscalculic, it may be quite a long route to get to that answer, which is why they need more time, because it isn't that they may never come up with the answer. And in the secondary setting, that is why we have assessment arrangements for SQA. You don't need a formal identification of dyscalculia to have assessment arrangements with the SQA. And equally for the SNASs, the SNSAs in primary and secondary, when you're doing those assessments, of course, you can use supports there. So really, when you're looking at subitizing, that's sometimes a bit quicker to spot, because what ordinarily you would expect to see is when you're looking at the dots on the left hand side, you'll see that there's 3, and when you're looking at them on the right hand side, you'll be able to see the number that is there. If you're a dyscalculic, you'll have great difficulty recognizing immediately the numbers that are there, the 7 that's there. You may need to you'll hear them count them out. They may be using their fingers. That's a clue. It doesn't, as I say, don't jump to the conclusion that they're dyscalculic, but that's one of the things we need to look at. So in the Scottish definition, learners with dyscalculia, we know that they benefit from this early identification, the support and the planning, and absolutely the review. It's a cycle. Sometimes they'll need tailored support. Particular activities encouraging the use of specific materials, which may include concrete materials and visual representations. And I would say, as a rule of thumb, that is normally in place for learners who are experiencing any of these difficulties, whether they're dyscalculic or not. That those concrete materials, don't be surprised in a secondary setting if they're still needed. It's really important that they're not struggling, because that's when you could then you get that mathematical anxiety. Effective inclusive learning and teaching can really support dyscalculic individuals. So in terms of how do we identify dyscalculia? Well, I mentioned before, in a way, it's no different to how we're identifying dyslexia. We're not talking about a one-off test. We're not talking about a screener. Now, if you choose to do that, that's you know, your local authority may have that involved in your sort of the package, if you like. As Scottish Government, I can't tell you what to do. But the beauty of having this conceptualized holistic assessment is that you're gathering information from different sources. And it's really, really child-centered. If you're looking at some kind of electronic screener, it is what it is for that period of time, for that learner sitting, participating in that screener. You may well get varying results from it as well. So we're looking for that more holistic view. It must involve the learner and the families in the process, that it's not something done to them. And be really mindful that parents, carers and children over 12 have a right to request an assessment. And that should be started within 10 weeks of that request. That's a legal entitlement. It doesn't mean the whole thing's got to be finished in 10 weeks. It means it's got to be started. And what we have experienced, I have a lot of queries about with the dyslexia assessment process, is how long should it take? And in a sense, in a wee bit, a bit how long is a piece of string? What shouldn't really be happening is that carrying on, in my particular opinion, it shouldn't be carrying on for longer than a year, an academic year. You should be able to gather this information in a term or two. But you know, I often hear about situations where it's going on year after year after year. We wouldn't normally be identifying dyslexia or dyscalculia sort of before P3. It is possible to do if you have all of the information, if you know that, and you're feeling really confident about it at the end of P2, particularly with dyslexia. But as an average rule of thumb, we're sort of looking at P3. That doesn't mean, though, that that's when that work has started. You would be, the parent, the carer may have identified a concern in nursery school. And we need to take that in and include that, if you like, in the transition information. We do have some resources that are being developed to support, you know, local authorities and schools and establishments. We have used the templates and the frameworks for ease that we've used for dyslexia. And you can see on this one that really similar to the dyslexia planning tool, you'll work around these different associated characteristics. It's a Word document and you can put in, you know, it could be a discussion with the learner. What are you feeling about this? Now, you may have to explain to some of the learners, age and stage appropriate, what do the terms mean? This could be a tool that you're using between yourselves, between colleagues. It's a really flexible tool. It can also help when you're pulling together the information at sort of a child's planning meeting, you know, once depending what it's called in your local authority, when you've got all of that evidence, and you are collectively deciding, is this child dyscalculic or not? And again, this does not have to go to an educational psychologist to make that determination, just the same as it doesn't have to with dyslexia. Different local authorities have got different processes in place. In Glasgow, for example, you have your SIMS, and I know in Glasgow that it's actually one of your colleagues who's on the working group from the Glasgow Dyslexia Support Service, you know, is involved in working with your Ed Psychs about the processes that are going to be used in your local authority. Similar things are happening in other local authorities because this is sort of a new definition and it's new paperwork, for want of a better word. But we have establishing needs forms in which you can quite quickly put down what's the concern, what supports have you put in place, what changes are you seeing, and if you're not seeing any changes, it then moves to the next level where somebody, you know, as a support for learning colleague would be coming involved. We're getting more information from the family, and you're pulling all of that, sometimes diagnostic, but you know, just really holistic information about the child together to come to that decision. And we have created a form in which you can pull all of that together, so the meeting's not kind of overrun with lots and lots of paperwork. We do have obviously some tips for effective inclusive teaching. that we know that learners who are experiencing difficulties, whether they are dyscalculic or not, can benefit from. And when you look at the list, these will be things that you will be doing anyway, because this is beneficial for the vast majority of learners. But there's some specific things to, obviously, numeracy and mathematics. It is making sure that before you move on to the next step of maths, that you are confident that that learner is ready to move on. And because otherwise they won't have that foundation to build on. And I can give you a really live example quickly before these ones finish. I'm a design technology teacher. I do not know my times tables. And perhaps controversially, I could tell you that design technology arguably is seen sometimes as harder than physics. It doesn't mean I couldn't be a design technology teacher. I just needed to use different approaches and different strategies. And that's when the extra time, and I'm not alone, I'm not in any way special. Lots of people experience this as well. What helps a lot of people, myself included, is to see those very clear links, those visual links in terms of mathematical concepts and making the connection. And having the ability, for example, if you have shown a child, a young person, how to carry out a particular piece of mathematical formula, like percentages, helping them document that, write that in a way that they can go back and they can remember how they did it. It might not be the way you showed everybody else to do it. And another thing that's really, really important is making sure they understand how to use a calculator. Because particularly when you move into scientific calculators, they can be really confusing. And it's well worth taking time with the learner to make sure they actually know how to use these supports, whether they're number squares, whether they're number lines, as Cuisinart rods, whatever they're going to be. But make sure they've got access to them. Creating opportunities for discussion. They may not want to admit to you that they're experiencing these difficulties. They may be embarrassed about it. But helping them understand, the earlier that is done, the more confidence that they then can develop within themselves. And, the last thing we want is for our learners to think there's something wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with them. They're just learning in a different way. And be aware that repetition, be careful with the repetition and the overlearning. Automaticity it can take longer to get. And actually, if you stop doing it, you can very quickly lose it. That's one of the reasons why I don't mind telling you I don't know my times tables. It doesn't matter how many times I was told, shown how to learn them. I had difficulty storing it, as does many, many children. And that's why they can access a calculator in a non-calculator exam. It's got nothing to do, as I mentioned before, with their cognitive ability. So this is the page on the National Improvement Hub. We are going to be loading more resources up that you'll be able to use. We'll really welcome any suggestions that you have, things that you feel would be very helpful. I'm going to put the link into the Jamboard soon, that you can put some things on there as well. You'll be able to download the Word documents. You can edit, you can alter. They've been developed so local authorities can make them their own. They're not written in stone by any manner of means, but what's in them is the information and the content that's in them is very valid. And we also have a mini guide that, although was developed predominantly to support learners who are dyslexic, will be of use to you. And it's our numeracy team in Education Scotland, 2 colleagues in that developed this. We looked at this through the dyslexia working group as well. It's a really, really helpful guide. And if you're not aware of it, our colleagues are running some professional learning webinars for Dyscalculia. And I don't think it's too late for you to register. The first 2 have already been, but there are 2 coming up, and they are practitioner led. So it isn't that we're sitting in in an ivory tower in Education Scotland creating all of these resources. Everything has been collaboratively developed and collaboratively led. I mean, there was a session as well at the Scottish Learning Festival too, in the 2022 festival. So I've got some discussion points. It's not enough for us just to create these resources. It's just the start of the process. It's about how can they help you in your journey, in your setting, and what are the key messages perhaps you could take from this presentation. And this definitely is a journey. As I said, we're not at the same point as we are with dyslexia, so we've got a lot of work to do still, but we're hoping that this is a step in the right direction for folk. And I'm just going to put into the chat the Jamboard for your breakout rooms. I appreciate very much that that was a real whistle-stop tour, and I would really highly recommend that you sign up for the professional learning webinars, because you have an opportunity to go into it in much more detail and to have some really good discussions about it.
I'm just going to take this opportunity to just to say that the value that you will get from the breakout rooms and having a dialogue with people, I can see numbers are starting to go. My other concern is that when people start to leave, I've already made up the rooms, so your rooms may be not as populated as you would expect. I do appreciate those who are staying on. I'm going to actually at the moment just say thank you very much to Fran, and I'm going to stop recording.
Okay.